All right. Welcome everybody for coming today. As you might have just heard me, this will be recorded. And for all the SAU folks, that will be housed on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion portal page. Anyone else, if you would like the link, please let me know and I'll be happy to provide that to you. Please mute your speakers and turn off your cameras to save the bandwidth. It'll help it go a little smoother. And I will be monitoring the chat for any of your questions, and I will then relay those to George, and that way to keep the noise down a little bit. So now I will introduce our speaker. George Eaton has been the U.S. Army Sustainment Command Historian since February 2002, as well as the Rock Island Arsenal Historian. Since May 2017, Mr. Eaton has also been the Chief for ASC Office of Communications and Engagement. In this position, he integrates the efforts of ASC Public Affairs, Congressional Relations, Business Relations, Historian, and Protocol. Prior to being hired as a historian, Mr. Eaton also served 21 years on active duty, retiring as an Army Lieutenant Colonel. During his career, George spent 3 years teaching military history at the U.S. Military Academy, West Point. Mr. Eaton holds a BA from Knox College, a master's in international relations from the University of Southern California's European program, an MA in military history from the University of Minnesota, and an MA in strategic studies from the Naval War College. I am happy to introduce Mr. George Eaton.
Thank you, Natalie. And what Natalie forgot to say was that I also taught adjunct in the St. Ambrose History Department for probably a good 10 years. Yeah, I see you there, Carrie. Thank you. Give you the call out there. And I stopped doing that a few years ago because I wanted to spend more time trying to finish my PhD, and then I got this new job that Natalie mentioned, and I haven't had any time to work on that. So hopefully someday when I retire, I'll get back to that kind of work. So I'm going to share the screen now. I've got some slides. There's not a whole lot in the slides. Some things that are better done visually than talking, and we'll talk through that, and we'll go from there. There's that. Let me, sorry, this is just, everything's a little bit different. I got to find the right button. There, okay. So what you see here today, and part of what we're talking about here, this naming of Army bases, it is, because of the recent scrutiny over these 10 bases that are here that are named after Confederate leadership. And so I just want to talk a little bit, not about what we're doing today, but I want to go back and talk about how did we get here in the first place, because these bases were all named in World War I and World War II, and when things were different. I want to talk about that, and it's I can't see my my clock on my computer when I'm full screen, so I got my phone up here so I know what time it is. So going through this, I really expected to see more blatant racism in 1917 and again in 1941 and 42, and I didn't see that much. So it's much more, it's much deeper. It's much more what we'd call today institutional racism, I think, that led to these things. And then there's some aspect of reconciliation, as well that was going on, especially in 1917. Maybe not so much in 1940 and World War II, but certainly early on. So let's go to this next slide here. So here's all the bases. There were not that many in World War I. So in World War I, most of the active army was already trained in some permanent camps, and also then there were, and those were the national other large camps for the most part in here. And then as we got into the war and we started activating the National Guard, they were in camps that are there that have the triangles. And then as we drafted more and more and created this national army, we had more cantonment areas. In World War I, we sort of knew all this was happening at once. There were only like 2 rounds of creating and naming bases in World War I. The general feel of the time was that it was too cold up north. When we first started in April of 1917, we think that we can get most of our training done. And then before we go overseas to France, and then we start to go overseas to France in the end of 17, then we realize that we have to do more training when it's going to be too cold up in the north. And so we push all these training camps down to the south. And so that's why the majority of these camps were in the south. It was just the same as preseason baseball. We just know it's going to be warm in that band, and so we pushed all these training bases down there. So you still have Camp Dodge, Camp Grant up here in the north, things that we see and may have heard about up here, but for the most part we pushed these down. And this is so as they push these camps down, we also basically the National Army Cantonment's a little bit different, but the National Guard camps, the National Guard camps a little bit different. The National Army National Cantonment's a little bit different. But the National Guard camps, these were elements of the National Guard of the different states, and we really thought that they would go down, train, and be gone. And that's really kind of what happened in this. So they went down and trained, and then the National Army Cantonment stayed a little bit longer. But most of the a huge number of those were also shut down by the time you even got to November of 1918, because as they trained the soldiers and no more in the pipeline, they closed them as they sent the soldiers off to France. So this was this short term here 18 months for the whole war effort for the United States, but relatively short term. Now I just want to say something else. So today, if you go back to slide, if it'll let me, so you see the word fort on most of these. So back then, if it was a camp, it was temporary. If it was a fort, it was permanent. And now today, a lot of the National Guard bases. So if you look at Camp Beauregard, Louisiana, that is very much of a Louisiana National Guard base, and they still call the National Guard bases camp today because they're not federal. But there was a sort of a different naming convention back in 1917. But again, if I talk and you hear me say the word camp, that's because they assumed it would be there for a little while, go away again, and then fort was more of a permanent structure at the time. So here again, so here's these camps. There were rules about how you named camps, and so here's a sort of a summary of these rules. So the Chief of Staff of the Army, the senior soldier in the Army, was the decision maker. And the Army War College had a history division, and they leaned on the history division to come up with recommendations for the names of camps. Now, some came from members of Congress or from local groups. A couple of those that came from local groups were instrumental that overwhelmed some other decision-making process. And that's where you start to see some of the racism that we talk about. These are the criteria. So the name of the fort should be after someone from the locale of the troops that were posted there. So if the Iowa National Guard went down to Mississippi, then you would expect that you would see a name on that camp that had meaning to the soldiers from Iowa or Illinois. So that's why you see a lot of these camps names from World War I are very northern names down in the South, and that was because they were talking to the soldiers who were being trained. It's part of the training in the Army is getting people to link into a bigger cause, to link into some sort of heritage and history or esprit de corps, and you do that often with the name of a particular leader. Now, a second one was you can't be unpopular in the local area. So I'll tell you what, nowhere in Georgia they're going to put a Camp Sherman, because of the March to the Sea in 1865. So there is a consideration here, clearly, for local perception and local reaction to these different names. If they're Union or Confederate, if there's Southern troops or Northern troops on this base, really the preference was to name them after a Union or Confederate leader. Now, remember that the last great conflict we'd had in the United States was the Civil War. Even the Spanish-American War had not created many heroes, even though Arthur MacArthur does have a base named after him later on. He was the leader in the Philippines. So but that was the most recent big conflict that we could look back to take a person, as a leader to emulate, to base some esprit de corps on. But if there was no Civil War era person from the actual location where they're going to put this vote, then they went off to other conflicts. Or if all the names were popular, they might go off to other conflicts. So you do see some Revolutionary War leaders, some Indian War leaders, things like that in these areas. The name had to be short because we're typing this stuff, or we're writing it by hand a lot. So short was important to the decision making, and then it can't be a living person. So this is sort of a long time, federal Army rule on naming things. The person should be deceased before you honor them by naming something after them. So I mean, these are key, and decision making is going to happen in the Army staff, and those decisions are going to come up to the Chief of Staff to make a decision. So what's important probably is the subtext before it gets to the Chief of Staff of the Army, because the Chief of Staff of the Army does, in fact, listen to the staff work below. Occasionally, they overturn. So, for instance, Forrest was recommended for a World War I post and was turned down by the Chief of Staff of the Army. Now, Nathan Bedford Forrest has got a lot of supporters in the South at the time because of his purely military efforts, but everybody knew afterward that he had led the KKK, and he created it, and so that was one of those things that it's just it may be the local population may love that name, but the Army was not going to necessarily support that. Jeb Stuart was also rejected for some similar reasons, though not as clear. And so for those kinds of reasons, a guy like McClellan, George McClellan, post was named after him in the South. Even in a general post as well, because he's sort of just, he just more neutral of a reputation at this point in time. So here's these results for World War I based on those rules. And so there's 19 major posts initially in 1917, and only 4 were named for Confederate leadership: Camp Lee, Camp Beauregard, Camp Gordon, and Camp Wheeler. Now, it's kind of interesting to me that they reject Nathan Bedford Forrest, but they do include Gordon. So why would they include Gordon? Gordon was also a senior leader of the KKK, but he had eventually become a senator from Georgia and had been the governor of Georgia. And so they looked at that political side, what was going on with him, and they choose Gordon for a post in Georgia, but they won't choose Forrest. The Nathan Bedford Forrest, had this, besides the KKK, was also directly linked, even then, with the Fort Pillow massacre, where Confederate troops slaughtered Black Union soldiers after they had surrendered. And they were just, even though we're talking about reconciliation, you can only go so far. Hood was rejected at the time. Bragg was rejected at the time early on. Later, they created Camp Bragg, which is now Fort Bragg, North Carolina, one of the bases that still have a Confederate name on them. But when Fort Bragg was first started, today it's the home of the airborne and special operations. But at the time, it was just a field artillery base, and Bragg was a field artillery officer who had been cited for heroism and for competency during the Mexican War. So I think that's how they get around that with him, even though they rejected him the first time around. So, so I said earlier that there's no overt racism in here. But how do you get this decision where you see Lee, Beauregard, Gordon, and Wheeler and Bragg chosen? So I think you sort of have to dive into what was going on at the time. So if you go back to about 1900 to 1907, there was quite a rise of what today we would call lost cause feeling in the South. And this is the period of time where you see this huge number of Confederate monuments being erected in the South. And the southern states were really, putting the final touches on Jim Crow. at that point in time, and segregation. And there is this incredible, codified almost. I say almost because blacks were citizens, but they'd found all kinds of ways to restrict voting rights and to restrict them their ability to freely act. And so that's the reality in the South. Also across the rest of the United States, there's a huge amount of institutional racism. Lots of people, military, civilians, it's okay that blacks are free, but I don't want them in my neighborhood, type stuff. I don't want them in the military. I don't want them this. I don't want them that. I want to keep them as a segregated and lower class of citizen. And we like to think sometimes that the North is free of that. We certainly are not. If you look at the documents from the period of time. And the military was very racist at the time as well. Maybe less so personally racist, but very much so institutionally racist. All Army units are segregated. Even the black units, the 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers, things like that, have white leadership. Even though they're black soldiers, there's a couple of units that have black leaders as well, but very, very few. And this is just this ongoing racism that says that blacks won't fight. They're not competent as fighters. You may be able to train them, but they certainly can't lead and do decision making. And that is also completely, through the Army system. And so when they bring up, when you bring up names of Confederate leaders, there really is no pushback unless you got somebody who really is notorious, like say Forrest. And doesn't have anything good on his side, on his balance sheet, like Gordon, because he became the governor. Now, so I'm not going to suggest in any way, shape, or form that the Army was above the fray on this. They were not. Lots of racist leaders, lots of military officers sort of weighing in about why you should have a Confederate leader from the certain area. But again, it's hard to tell what the personal feelings are of these people, but you can certainly see the institutional piece of that because the Army was segregated, and it's not going to be unsegregated until 1950 or so. Now, I mentioned there were two waves of these naming of these of the forts, and I tell you, after the first wave, there we go. Sorry, after the first wave came out, the newspapers across the South just drummed up that finally the Northerners are recognizing how great our leadership was. Finally this and finally that, and the Confederacy had all these great leaders as well. And so I think that probably the political pressure probably is higher on Army leadership after, say, January of 1918, after the first wave were all sort of announced in 1917 than it was beforehand. Because then you got senators calling, you've got congressmen calling, you got the Daughters of the Confederacy. When you name a new base, let's make sure we name that base after a Confederate leader if it's in the South. The basic rules remain that if it's mainly a Northern National Guard unit, you're not going to name it after a Southerner, but there's more pressure. And the most obvious case of this was Fort Benning in Georgia, and that name was not suggested by the War College. It came totally from the Daughters of the Confederacy, and I think the Rotary in Columbus, Alabama, and piled on with their political elected leaders from there. And Benning was, another one of these not well-known leaders. Yes, a leader in the Confederacy. We know him more today by reading his writings during the war and after the war, where he continued to say that the war was in fact about slavery, was a fact about the ability to maintain slavery, and totally unapologetic for that when the war is over. So this is a guy that didn't just end the war and slip away into obscurity, but he was more like, say, a Forrest, or not as bad as a Forrest or a Gordon in the KKK, I don't think, but also never apologized for that. And so this one came hard on the senior leadership, but I think they bent on that one. I think that they decided they had to follow suit with this one. So in the, after World War One is over, only Bragg and Benning survived that interwar period. Lee, these other ones here, they all closed and then reopened again later. Oh, I meant to mention Wheeler more closely. Wheeler is up there in the list of he's a CSA, a Confederate leader. But Wheeler's an interesting fellow in that even at kind of an advanced age of being in his 60s, when the Spanish-American War broke out, he came back in and he was a two-star general in the American Army afterwards. And so he's one of these weird fellows that sort of gets rehabilitated because he comes back into the military, 40 years later, and to fight for the United States in general. And so he was a Confederate leader during the war, but by the time you get to this naming phase, he's somewhat rehabilitated himself by being a really good, solid leader in the Spanish-American War. And so I have him listed there as a Confederate leader, but in fact, he's not seen, I don't think, as a Confederate leader at the time of the war. Okay, so the rules here in World War II change a little bit. And the Secretary of War, so a higher level political appointee, not a uniformed soldier, is the decision maker in World War II. The person had to be born or associated with the area. So we're going to see things like, say, Pickett for Pickett's Charge. They nominate him to have a post in Oregon named after him, even though he's from Virginia, because he had been involved in some action in the Pacific Northwest earlier in his career. And again, the War College historical section made most of the recommendations. I found this interesting because I saw this in several memos. Some names were too long. If you have too many words you have to put in there, it's bad, but also bad connotation. So Graves, who was a senior leader in World War I, and this guy Toombs, in both cases of these memos, the people mention that if we have a Fort Graves or a Fort Toombs, that's really not good psychologically for our soldiers that are training there, because now they're just thinking about being in a grave or having a tombstone. So there was some of that kind of recognition of the psychological aspect of these names. So there is no single great map that shows you all the military bases in World War II. I was kind of frustrated. I spent hours looking for one the past several days. So this is about the best I can get. And if you blow this up later on, you're not going to see it anyway. You can go on Amazon and buy this map, I guess, and I declined to do that. But you can see all those little red dots. Those are all Army bases. So there's more than 110 Army bases, and these bases, unlike World War I, are longer. Some of them are established as early as 1940 with the state of emergency when we started calling up the National Guard, and others, as we get into the big drafts of World War II, they pop up posts where they need to for a lot of specific tasks. Some of those 110 I looked at because they had names that might be Southern leadership. And there's like 10 of them that are training people on railroad operations, things like that. So these are much more specialized and a lot more of them. So, but again, you can see most of them are in the South or on the West, along the coast, where there is the weather's better than up here, in the upper Midwest, where you're going to get a lot of snow and cold weather training. Unless you want to do cold winter training, then you send them to Fort Drum, New York, or places like that, or up to Camp Ripley in Minnesota, where they can get a chance to do some cold weather training as well. A lot of the camps in the South were generally supposed to be named after Confederates, but there's a lot of pushback on that. And in the end, you only get about 8 new Confederate names. And then there are posts in the South that are named after non-Confederates. So Fort Campbell, Kentucky, Fort Stewart, Georgia, Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, Leonard Wood in Missouri, Fort Jackson. None of these are Confederate leaders. Andrew Jackson, Leonard Wood, who's a Army officer in the 1870s, 80s, 90s. Chaffee, who creates the Armor Corps, basically. Fort Stewart is named for a General Stewart from the Revolutionary War. I can't remember his full name now. And Fort Campbell also is named after a pre-Civil War military leader. And so you just there, but you do have these names that are here, and I have some of these just to talk about some of these different leaders to give you some points, because what we have for World War II, we don't have for World War I, is really a lot of correspondence on nominations, and then the summaries that the War College put together for these different people. So Fort Polk, Louisiana was pretty easy. There was no pushback. There may have only been one nomination here, and Leonidas Polk was a Confederate general who was also a bishop, Episcopal bishop, and you know, they called him the fighting bishop actually during the course of the war, and from Louisiana. So Fort Polk, Louisiana, there really wasn't much push. A.P. Hill's an interesting one because A.P. Hill was one in Virginia, was one of Lee's not his best generals, but one of his one of who's around him the most, maybe, or his subordinate the most through a lot of the war. And I don't think there was a whole lot of excitement about naming a post after A.P. Hill. The problem was the other two people that the War College suggested had no connection at all with Virginia. And so this goes back to this other idea: is the name has got to be somewhat acceptable to the local population. Because if you don't get a name to the local population, then the local population, you know, starts to agitate against the post. And so the senior leadership was very aware of that piece of politics. They want to say there was no politics involved in these, but there clearly was lots of politics involved. And this was the politics of acceptance. This is the politics of ensuring that the local area supports the war effort. This is the politics to make sure that your soldiers aren't accosted off post, which happens to a lot of black soldiers. Also happens to a lot of northern soldiers that are too northern down in southern climes. But you know, we don't talk about as much as we know that black soldiers were accosted off post or ignored or segregated, and you know, prejudicial treatment. I'm missing a word here. Sorry. Fort Gordon again. You know, that one had been inactivated, but comes back again. I think it's the exact same thing that happened in World War I. Is that they know that about his reputation. But the local population wants him because he was the governor of Georgia. I mentioned Pickett earlier, that was originally nominated for a post out in Eugene, Oregon, and they turned that one down for him. But eventually, the post in Virginia is named after him, and that's one of our enduring posts there. Fort Rucker was a lot of argument over Fort Rucker. This is in Alabama. It's where our aviation school is today. The guy who is named after is in many pieces of paper is named as called sort of not a backwoods but a third tier Confederate leader. But after the Civil War, becoming sort of industrialist, and he was pushed very hard by a senator from the area who called personally the Chief of Staff of the Army, George Marshall, and wanted Rucker, this name after Rucker, and a lot of local popular support. And I don't think so much for Rucker, because I don't think anyone knew who he was. A popular support for a Southern Confederate leader. And so this is the politics. This is the politics of public opinion, the politics of news, the politics of making sure that you have all the support for the war effort going on. And I think George Marshall makes a decision just to do it so that he has support down there from that senator and from the elected contingent from Alabama. The history division had several names, other names for Fort Rucker, and one of those was Longstreet. And Longstreet never ever gets a good chance to have a fort named after him in this period. Even though the Secretary of War writes his and says, "Hey, Miss Longstreet, the next post we start, we're going to name after your husband." And so this is again that politics of popular opinion and politics of low opinion. So you don't know the history of Longstreet. He's one of Lee's senior commanders. He fights all over, much more than some officers. He fights on the East Coast. He fights at Vicksburg. He fights in different places, across the web of the Confederacy. But when the war was over, he became a Republican. And he also suggested that maybe part of the problems had been the decision making of senior leaders, which would imply meant Lee. And so the Southerners, especially when we get the Lost Cause going later on, just destroy his reputation. They just go after him like crazy. And I don't think you could have put a Fort Longstreet anywhere in the South and not had a near riot outside the gates. And so Longstreet, who really was, I have great, other than the fact that he's a Confederate, I have great appreciation of his abilities and talents and his thought, his intellectual approach to things. but he could not have gotten a fair shake to have a fort named after him in the South because they saw him as a traitor to them. So it's very interesting how those politics come into play. Fort Hood is chosen down where it is today in Killeen, Texas, over Hood. Hood was a senior general of the Civil War. He commanded the Texas Brigade. He wasn't from Texas. He moves to Texas after the war, becomes a sort of an adopted Texan later on, and it's a pretty easy decision early on. But later on the war, Fort Hood, which is a tank destroyer training base at the time, they wanted to name this after, change the name to Leslie McNair. And McNair was killed in France. He was our senior general officer killed in the Civil War. He's from Maryland. There's now a very small Fort McNair named after him. The public pushback on changing that name was absolutely astronomical. Newspaper editors, congressmen, the Daughters, the Confederacy, you name it. They were writing letters to the War Department saying, "We want our Fort Hood. He's the greatest leader. Blah blah blah. It'd be a shame." And so they don't change the name. They don't change it after, name it for McNair. Who there's a lot of senior Army leadership that wants McNair, and they just can never manage to change that name. So this is something we'll talk about a little bit later on, is how hard it is to change a name once it's set and it becomes part of the local local identity. So Nathan Bedford Forrest gets in finally with a lot of push from a lot of different Southerners at this as well. And this is kind of interesting because when they talked about something about Forrest, General Marshall, when they were going to create a new training base in Tennessee, General Marshall in his memo say, go to Tennessee, ask them what they want, and we'll take whatever they want, so long as unless the name is unsuitable for psychological or other reasons. So even then, I think Marshall was aware that they might throw a name at him that he didn't want, and they do. They throw Nathan Bedford Forrest at him, and he concedes. And so again, this is there's a lot of racism inside the military, but the kind of racism that Forrest is accused of the slaughter of black soldiers, the violence of the KKK and things like that, you would think that nobody would live with that, and they did. And that's really kind of it's a sad commentary on how concerned they were about the war effort, that they would name something after Forrest. And then Van Dorn, another one. Even though the same idea of unless they're unsuitable for other reasons, Van Dorn was a minor general in the Confederacy, whose claim to fame is that he was murdered in 1863 by the husband of the woman he was having an affair with. And he was known to be a womanizer. And even after he died, other Confederate generals said, basically in their writings, no great loss, because he was immoral. And yet he gets a post named after him too. It's just amazing, I think, sometimes, even though they knew that what his reputation was, that they still name it. But again, I think it has to go back to, are you making the people of the South happy so that they continue the war effort? Now, there are some other, I mentioned this earlier, there's some of these other posts in the South that are named after Northerners that are in the South. Leonard Wood is in Missouri. I'm not, it's right in the middle of the state. Is that South or not? I'm not sure. Leonard Wood was, and they also broke the mold on short names too, because they had to put both names because there's so many Woods out there. But there's lots and lots of these that are, I think that the Confederate ones sort of stick out at us even now. When you get a Forrest or a Van Dorn or a Rucker or a Gordon, they still stick out at us, even though I only count about 16 of 110 that are named after Confederates, and yet still they seem to be kind of notorious. And even that, naming something after a guy after Lee just sort of pales in comparison to some of these guys that they name after. So again, some of these other considerations to take about when you're doing this. Most of these forts are named after either Northern leaders or leaders that are not associated with the Civil War. And there is one member that says, we pretty much used up all the good names for the Civil War. You better go look for something else. But segregation is important still, and it's just the way the Army is structured at the time. And what I found interesting is that if you had Army bases or camps that were primarily going to be used by African American soldiers. They named those after Afro American leaders. So you've got George Washington Carver, Camp Carver, Camp Jordan. These are named after known black leaders or heroes from the First World War or heroes from the Buffalo, Scouts or something like that. And they were careful. What's interesting is even if I pull up a list today, and I know there was a Fort Jordan, I know there was a Camp Jordan, I know there's a Camp Carver, a list of all the posts from World War One, they're not on there. I can't find them. And so the paperwork that I've seen, the documents I've seen, is not complete because it doesn't list these. Now, often these were camps that were a sub-camp. So there was a larger post, and then a piece of the post was segregated off for training black soldiers. And so maybe if you dug deeper into the Seattle Port of Embarkation files, you might find more paperwork on Camp Carver or Camp Jordan. But the fact that they're not listed on these other lists, we still don't, I don't think we as historians, we still don't see the scope of the segregation and the racism that they're totally forgotten after the war. We have this list of all these other 110 names, but I can't find them. Now, this list I have of names, I spot checked, but I knew there were some because I saw paperwork on those, and then I went back to get that list and couldn't find them. So maybe some of this 110 that I have a list of are black leaders that they've named these for African American segregated units, but I just don't see it. I just find it interesting to know that they were very careful to try to pick leadership that would mean something to the African American soldiers that were there, an inspiration to them. Someone they could see they could see the same color. They didn't feel like they were being discriminated against by that name, and yet we don't even track that name later on. Also, some Native Americans. There's some attempts to name some bases after Native Americans, and all of those fail. So Chief Joseph is the one I've seen the most. So Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce, or Nez Perce, depending on how you pronounce that. And they wanted to name the same base they wanted to name after Pickett in Oregon. They wanted to name after Chief Joseph because he was from the Oregon Territory, and that a white soldier gets the choice there as well. So it's hard to tell. I saw so little correspondence about these different attempts or suggestions to name after Native American warriors that it's kind of hard to get to the basis of what the reason was. But I suspect it was just institutional racism again, this time against Native Americans and not against African Americans as well. There was a lot of congressional influence, but really George Marshall and the Army parries most of that off, I think. They apologize a couple of times. There's a couple of base names, especially Fort Campbell. I can't remember the name of the guy they wanted to name Fort Campbell that they don't choose. But they're getting direct letters from congressmen, essentially, with implied threats as to their career if they don't change the name. And the Army said, no, we're not going to name it. We've already made a decision, and we're going to go from there. And I mentioned earlier about Mrs. Longstreet and why I think that's. In the same time frame, there's other politicians that make suggestions, and this is one that's sort of catches you by surprise. And I think it goes to the understanding of how racist institutionally we were at the time, and that is that Harry Truman, senator from Missouri, suggests that a base in Missouri, I think it may have been Fort Leonard Wood, be named after General Price. And General Price was a Southern sympathizing militia leader, responsible for a lot of the guerrilla warfare in Missouri in the Civil War, and then later on becomes more of a formal Confederate general. And I don't know. I don't know what Truman's reasoning was. Maybe he's trying to make his constituents happy, but he's willing to actually throw a name out like that. And it's interesting because Truman, a couple of years later, is the one that signs off the final requirements to desegregate the military. Which is why I say he's interesting, because there is this institutional aspect of the racism. There's this keeping your constituents happy aspect of naming, and yet Truman will be one of the ones that later on will sign off and say we've got to stop the segregation. Probably mainly because of manpower concerns. I'm not going to give him too much credit there, but he does change his tune a little bit later on. So after the war, all those posts, most of those posts were inactivated. Van Dorn and Forrest, the two that offend me the most, are gone by 1946. Even though the Forrest was one of the largest training bases in World War II. And then the camps were turned into forts, which made them permanent. And then we get back to that list we have today of the 10 that are still in place. Now, it is harder, in fact, I think, to change the name of something that's considered permanent, but it's not impossible. But there was little incentive to change through most of this period. You know, as the Civil War went further and further into our backgrounds, further and further into the history books, you know, people recognize Lee and some of these memos said very clearly, and you know, everybody knows Pickett, the most glorious charge in American history. But I think there's a little incentive to change some of these names because they just don't pop up. And I'll tell you that as a soldier, 21 years in active duty, moving around, most of our posts, if I had asked a soldier at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, who it was named after, they wouldn't have a clue. They just don't talk about that so much in the military, and it takes an awakening to recognize the fact that, you know, I'm serving here at Fort Bragg, a guy that, you know, fought so that blacks would remain enslaved. I'm sitting here training at Fort Benning, Georgia, a post where the guy during the course of the succession wrote down that this war is about slavery and maintaining our slavery institution, and after the war, you know, continued. Or Gordon. Probably nobody knows that Gordon was involved with the KKK. And so part of the incentive to change is sort of the flip side of what I was mentioning before about the popular pressure to name forts in the first place and public opinion outside the gate. It is that, you know, you don't change later on because now nobody's really aware. I mean, they were very aware who the people were in 1940 or 1917, but by the time you get to 2000, nobody's really often even aware who the people are. And I think this is part of our problem, you know, that we named these things initially sort of to create some esprit and some leadership and people to look up to. And then over time, the Army has sort of forgotten that, and we stopped talking about that at all. So I can tell you that most of the places I served in the military around that they were named after some of these leaders, other than Lee, people for the most part don't quite recognize that they were Confederate leaders until you point it out to them. And then a lot of people get offended. You know, and if we get into the current period, more offended now than they were, you know, maybe at other different times. So, you know, so it's in sum, it really is kind of difficult to tell you how much race actively played in the decisions. There's some that I pointed out that I think very clearly. It's the Confederacy. It's making a point. You know, it's you know, choosing a name you may not want to name, but it's not so much about racism. It's about public opinion and the war effort later on. And so, I mean, we recognize that the Army, like many other institutions, is inherently racist, or it was at the time. I think the Army's getting better, but still there is that institutional racism that permeated a lot of this throughout the 20th century. And that doesn't forgive anybody. I don't want to forgive anybody for these things, especially a Van Dorn or a Forrest or a Gordon. But I do want to try to say that, explain a little bit the mindset and the culture and the context of the time that these places were named, because it's not quite, it's not necessarily clear, as clearly racist as we might think today. And then we get in the modern period, and what you get then in the modern period is then just this inertia. That we don't change things because it's hard. We don't change things because we have to explain why we did it and why we changed. So that's where I am. That's sort of what I want to talk about in general. I'm not going to get into the current events on this thing. Commission's been appointed, and we'll see what the commission does. But if you have any questions over what I covered, and if I can clarify anything that I talked about, and I see a question from Carrie Manning. Yeah, there is a precedent, but it doesn't happen very often, Carrie. And I don't know that it's happened in my memory at all. So I've been around the Army, for 40 or 50 years because my dad was also in the Army. In that time, I don't know that there's any posts that were renamed. Now, there's been some renaming. Say, if we took an Army post and made it an Air Force establishment or a Space Force, establishment, things like that, renaming there because you've changed service and you're trying to make the name of the post linked to a different person to create that esprit de corps type thing. But inside the Army itself, I just don't. I have no recollection of any of this happening. We close bases. It's easier to close a base, I think, than it is to rename it. Are there any other questions? Anything else I can try to clarify? I know this was kind of fast, and I got to tell you that I expected to find a lot more dripping racism in some of these discussions, especially from local populations and politicians, and I just didn't see it. I was kind of interested. I have a kind of a limited set of documents I was looking at that I would like to look at some more, later on. But it just leads me down to this institutional. It's quiet. People know they shouldn't say too much about these things. Maybe they're trying to make sure that they maintain civil support for the war effort, but it doesn't drip with racism, which I guess that's the whole problem. Institutional racism, isn't it? It doesn't drip with so inherently, so overtly racist. It just sort of is part of the system.
Are there naval ships named after Confederates? I mean, I know that each class of naval ships seems to have its own criteria for naming, but does this phenomenon occur in the Navy?
I think there were one or two, Carrie, but I think that all those are gone now. And that's the interesting thing about the Navy as opposed to the Army. A ship has got a lifespan. So if you start to feel like you need new ships and new names, you look at for a wide variety of names. You're not stuck in on this Confederate, this Civil War era, because they're in service for 30 or 40 years and they go away again. I think my recollection of the current focus is that there are like 10 in the Army. There's one maybe in the Marines. There's a couple of Air Force ones. I don't remember them saying anything about Navy bases, but I don't recall ever hearing about Navy ships at this point in time. So it's possible, but I would think probably less likely, especially with newer ships as they come out. They're gonna make sure they don't make that mistake. Yeah, Allison. I think there's going to be some fallout. I think that there's not I suspect it'll be initially sort of a wide range pushback from white supremacists and maybe from the general culturally in the South as well. But then it'll sort of drop down into a local resistance that will last more long term. Because we can talk about, I'm going to change the name of Fort Bragg to Fort something, and there'll be a lot of pushback, and then eventually it'll just be the people of Fort Bragg, in Fayetteville, North Carolina, that'll remember it. And because and I think it'll be quiet pretty quick. You got to remember that most of those people, a lot of those people owe their livelihood to the Army in their area, and so they're not going to get too upset about it. But I do think that you could potentially see some resistance. But I think everything going on right now is going to possibly lower some support for the military in general. So I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, I don't think it's wrong to be having this discussion now, and you just eventually have to decide whether or not it's what you can live with, which means you get some kind of bland names, that are acceptable to everybody, and that's probably. I don't know how the commission is going to work, but I suspect that they're going to be pretty astute to that. They got to find names that don't give you a reason, not a thorn in the side, to continue being upset about the fact that you took away the name of a Fort Hood or a Fort Bragg or a Fort Polk.
So this is Allison again, and how does this commission work, and who's on it? I mean, so they're going to come up and say, yes, we should change names, or no, we shouldn't?
Allison, I'm not going to get into current affairs, but I will say that the National Defense Authorization Act, signed, passed by both chambers, said that they are going to change, and they gave them like 3 years, I think, to do it. And there's different appointment schedules for the commission. And I have no idea how they're going to select the commission members or what the process is going to be. I don't think it's worked out at all. All I do know as a fact is that the NDAA for 2021, said it's going to happen. So I think it's one of the ones all of us are going to be watching very carefully and with interest to see how this thing works.
Okay, so the commission is working on the process for changing.
I don't think the commission's even met yet.
Okay.
So yeah, as I said, they're going to have to lay out a process. They're going to have to lay out their procedures and what the decision matrix is going to be. But again, all of that is just I just don't know how that's going to. I don't think anybody knows how it's going to work yet. So I'd be premature to say really anything other than the fact that it's in the law. Okay, with nothing else, thanks for letting me babble for 45 minutes or more about this. Again, I some of my results were a little surprising, a little less clear cut than I expected to see them. A little less than the reconciliation move that I've always talked about in this period of time, I think, and more about practical decisions of manpower and support. And not offending too many people in the local area, and then this institutional racism that is inherent, I think, in so many of our different aspects of our society. With that, I'll turn it back over to either Ryan or to Natalie.
I'll go ahead and take it. Thank you very much, George, for today's very informative conversation. We really appreciate your time with us. Thank you, Natalie, for putting this together as well. And thank you all, St. Ambrose, for participating. Please be aware of the other things going on this week, Civil Rights Week 2021. The Walk to Remember, again, is self-guided, and so you can do that on your own. Make sure you end at Student Activities or Student DEI office, same place, in Lower Rogowski, to take your pictures and re-sign or sign the pledge. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your day and a great week. Bye-bye, everyone.